So let us start by settling our body into a comfortable yet upright or alert posture. Then we can calm and clear the mind utilizing any breath awareness meditation or technique that we're familiar with, such as taking a deep cleansing breath and letting go of all interferences. Then we can align our mind with the source of spiritual inspiration. In Buddhist terms, that would be taking refuge in the three jewels of the Buddha as the teacher, the Dharma as the spiritual teachings themselves, and the Sangha as the community of practitioners. And if we ourselves are not particularly Buddhist, but just have a general interest in the spiritual path, then we can identify our own source of inspiration, whatever it is that has drawn us to the spiritual path, having the qualities of compassion, wisdom, and power. We can identify them as equivalent to the three jewels. So we can invoke that refuge in the source of inspiration through the thinking of the meaning of the first two lines of the following prayer, and then cultivate as expansive and as compassionate a motivation as we can, thinking that the activity we're engaged in today is not just for our own individual benefit, but so that we can help benefit others. And that we cultivate while thinking of the meaning of the last two lines of the following prayer of refuge and bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the highest assembly. From the virtuous merit that I collect by practicing giving and other perfections, may I attain the state of a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. May I attain the state of a Buddha, meaning purifying all defilements, all limitations, and cultivating the supreme qualities of universal compassion, universal wisdom, and the universal ability to benefit others, the state of a Buddha, in order to benefit all sentient beings. May we attain the state of a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I was wondering why all the people in that room were facing the wrong way. Okay, so welcome everybody to this evening. The title of the presentation is Reducing the Weight of Negative Karma. And the reason I thought to talk about this was because one of the basic teachings in Buddhism is to observe one's karma. In other words, set a watch or a lookout onto the activities of our body, speech, and mind. In other words, our physical actions, the kinds of things we say, the emotions and the kinds of thoughts we have, to check up on that and to try to discriminate between those actions which are harmful, not just to others, but to ourselves, and therefore to be avoided, and those which are helpful, and therefore are to be practiced. This is among the most fundamental teachings of the Buddha, and the reason it is of such fundamental importance is that the purpose of the Buddha, and not just the historical Buddha Shakyamuni, but all of the enlightened beings who have ever appeared, their fundamental purpose is to help others overcome whatever suffering or dissatisfaction they may be experiencing. And from the insight of the enlightened beings, that suffering, that dissatisfaction, is the direct result of the harmful actions, in other words, the negative or non-virtuous karma that they have created. This is a major insight of the Buddha and the other enlightened beings, that whatever happens in our life that is untoward, unwanted, in the nature of unhappiness, all of that derives from forces that come from within ourselves, not as punishments coming from the outside or as the result of external forces, though they may provide the conditions for unhappiness. But the root cause of it are the actions that we ourselves engage in, motivated by the various delusions such as hatred and jealousy and greed and arrogance, and all of them deriving from a mistaken notion of the nature of reality. So this is a fundamental teaching of the Buddha. So it's not just a philosophical description, it's an actual aid. If we wish to be happy and wish to avoid unnecessary suffering, then it's important that we discriminate between those mental, verbal, and physical actions which lead to unhappiness and those which lead to happiness, avoiding one and practicing the other.
Arrived at 3009 Pine Tree Drive.
So sorry. It's okay. It's okay.
So in many presentations of karma, that is the law of cause and effect between the actions that we engage in and the consequences or the results we experience, in many of the presentations, the emphasis is on the non-virtuous actions, the negative, the harmful actions. And the reason is that, first and foremost, we wish to overcome suffering. So we identify the harmful actions because those are the ones we try to wean ourselves away from, to diminish them, refrain from them, and eventually eliminate them. Okay. And it occurs to me, both as a student and also having been in the presence of other students for so many years, that this teaching and this emphasis on negative karma can present a certain difficulty for us students, because we hear that the emphasis is so much that by engaging in these negative, non-virtuous actions, we're creating dissatisfaction and suffering and pain for ourselves. That emphasis is so strong that sometimes we react to that news or that teaching with a certain kind of fear. I don't know whether you've ever felt that or not, but there's a sense that as long as the delusions are still present, that virtually anything that I do is going to be bad, you know? And people can get very, very frightened, almost paralytic, almost afraid to act, because they become so high, and when I say they, I really mean we. Right? We become so afraid that, uh-oh, I might be doing something wrong, and therefore creating suffering, not just only for myself, but eventually for others, that we can become afraid to act, afraid to speak, almost afraid to think. Because it's pointed out how many of these actions of body, speech, and mind are destructive. Did you ever get that feeling?
Yeah.
You know, that it's, when I was first a student in India back in the 1970s, we coined a term for new students, meaning especially new students who are just hearing about karma for the first time and getting very overly self-conscious, afraid to act, afraid to speak, afraid to think. And of course, it was directed, you know, in fun against the new students, but actually was against ourselves as well, you know. And we said that people like that, people who are this very kind of uptight, fearful state of mind, had become dharmatos. Not comatose, but dharmatos. Right? Comatose as a result of studying Dharma.
Yeah.
Okay. So, And of course, there is a benefit in being cautious about our actions of body, speech, and mind. There's no question about that. Just as there's a benefit in being cautious before sticking your finger into a candle flame. You know, you want to be cautious about that. You want to teach your children to be cautious about that because it hurts to be burnt, right? And it hurts to experience the consequences of anger and greed and the harmful actions motivated by anger and greed and the other delusions. So it's proper to be cautious. But we can, in a sense, overdo it. You know, we can lose any sense of flexibility or balance and become very, very uptight. And I know Lama Yeshe used to kind of make fun in a very loving manner of students who had adopted, in their practice of Buddhism, had adopted this very uptight attitude. So I thought it would be helpful to kind of avoid the excesses of that kind of reaction, to help indicate that yes, it is important to refrain as much as possible from harmful actions because they are harmful, because they have negative consequences, but it's also good to understand that there's things that we can do about it. That if it turns out that we, under the force of habit or delusion, that we do something or say something or think or feel something that has a destructive element to it, that we're not condemned. That's not the end of the story. Right? We can always inject an attitude which helps to minimize the danger resulting from such negative, non-virtuous actions. Now, the teaching in which this is most fully embodied is something which I think many people here have heard at one time or another, what's known as the four opponent powers. I'm curious, how many people have received one or more teachings on the four opponent powers? Quite a lot, not everyone here, but quite a few. So I think it's worth going over them, but with an emphasis of how each of these opponent powers serves to modify or lessen the consequence of a non-virtuous action. Right? So we needn't feel that, oh, I did something wrong and now I'm doomed. No, you know. I told a lie, now I'm going to hell. That kind of attitude. Because it's easy to fall into that state. Even if we don't say it in those terms, we can feel it. You know, we can get really uptight and paralytic because of that. So, there is one list that might serve as an introduction to this presentation, and you have it in your little booklet on page 3. Under Roman numeral 4, it says, knowing the 6 factors that determine the weight of karma. That idea of karma having weight and how you can modify the weight means that a karmic activity we engage in can be relatively strong and have a very big effect. For instance, if it's negative, it could have a big suffering effect. Right? Or relatively light, in which it may still have a negative effect, but not particularly strong. So it alleviates a lot of the suffering that would normally come. And then if practiced diligently enough, it not only eliminates the negative effect, it not only lessens the negative effect, but if done with proper understanding, it can actually eliminate it. So even if we have engaged in something negative, we don't have to, we're not forced to experience its consequences. Okay? So I'm not going to talk about all of the elements in this list, but I wanted to mention them as a kind of a jumping off point for the discussion. So just to talk about it generally in the beginning, and then a little bit more specifically later in relationship to those, what I call the four opponent powers. Okay? So, knowing the 6 factors that determine the weight or the heaviness, or if reduced, the lightness of karma, of karmic actions and their consequences. So the first one, letter A, it's described as the nature of the action. Many of you know the list of the 10 major non-virtuous actions. There's of the body, it's killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct. And then of speech, it's harsh speech and lying and divisive speech and idle gossip or meaningless talk. And then of mind, it's covetousness, ill will, and perverted views. And then of course there are many, many subdivisions of these. In fact, it is said in some teachings that the Buddha gave 84,000 different teachings to combat the 84,000 different delusions. But this list is abbreviated to just 10. Because if we understand these 10, we can figure out the other ones. The other ones are in the category. The other day, I'm not sure here whether it was here or in Deerfield Beach, but the other day I mentioned that one of the harmful actions of body, the most harmful, is killing, taking the life of others. It doesn't say anything in the teaching about punching somebody in the nose. But if you know that killing is a harmful action of the body, then even though it doesn't say avoid punching people in the nose, you can figure it must be a subcategory of that. Just a less violent version of a physical assault. So it doesn't have to mention all the subdivisions of it. As long as we have an idea of the 10, we can use our intelligence to figure out the rest. Okay? So when it talks about the nature of the action as determining relative heaviness or relative lightness, this is simply talking about the fact that in this list, something like killing, by nature, is much, much heavier than idle gossip. Right? So there's a variation in the actions just based on its very nature. Of course, the lamas are always hastened to add, by its nature, meaningless talk or idle gossip is the least heavy of all the non-virtuous of body and speech, but it's the biggest waste of our time. Right? And therefore, by nature it may not be that heavy, but what it does in terms of depriving us of the real time to cultivate a Dharma practice is quite serious, can be quite serious. Okay, so I won't have much more to say about the nature of the action. The second one, B, things are heavy or not through the force of thought, meaning the force of the motivation behind the action. This is very significant, and this will come up more when we talk about the four opponent powers. So, sometimes we might engage in a harmful action, but more out of some kind of carelessness, rather than because we have a very strong motivation to hurt someone. And so the power of the thought is different. To give an example which can probably has happened to all of us in one way or the other, is walking along or driving the car. It's very easy to be responsible for killing insects or small animals. It happens all the time. whether we know it or not. Okay? But in most cases, in 99.9% of the cases, there's no intention to give harm. You know, we're not consciously running down little critters. You know, we could be. Some people are weird enough to do something like that, but most people, it's just they're not aware. It's kind of accidental, unintentional. So the thought behind it, the motivation behind it, is not harmful. Right? Whereas there's other acts of killing and other physical activities in which the thought, the motivation behind it, is really consciously cruel. You know, we want to hurt, we want to kill, we want to injure. So the force of the thought is much stronger in that kind of action than one that's done with either very weak motivation or more or less accidentally and unintentionally. So that makes a big variation. Similarly, there are situations in the world, unfortunate situations, where people who are under the power of others have to follow their lead. You know, that happens in the military, it happens under various repressive governments. There's many situations in which that can happen. So the underling is engaging in a harmful action, but not because he or she really wants to do it. Right? It's kind of being forced into it by circumstances. And so the power of the negative thought is much less in that person's mind than it is, let's say, in the sergeant or the general who wants to destroy the enemy and is ordering other people to do it. You know, the thought, the motivation is much stronger in the person, or can be. There are other situations, but it can be much stronger in the person who's ordering the attack than in the poor Slavs who have to carry out the attack. Right? So that's another example how even though a person might be the active agent of giving harm, the actual depth or strength of their motivation might be much less. Okay? So that would be relatively, speaking in terms of comparison, the karmic consequences of that would be less than the karmic consequence of the same kind of killing done with a strong, violent, aggressive, hateful motivation. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I'm not really understanding.
Please.
Because I believe we all have choices, and like when you're talking about killing, nobody can force you to do things that you don't really want. I mean, you know, and that's an issue that I'm having on a World War II. Like, I don't understand how, you know, if I put myself in situations sometimes, I could never, for instance, be forced to kill somebody else. I would have to probably remove my life first, because I could never live with the consciousness. And it's my choice at the end of the day. And that's what I don't understand that. I mean, I hear it, but I don't. I mean, I do understand my logical mind, but my heart doesn't.
Well, that's good. It's good if one has the strength, the moral strength to be able to avoid that pressure. But there's a lot of pressure to engage in negative actions. And not everyone has the strength to combat that. Some people have more strength to do it, others don't. Plus, we might think beforehand, I would never do that. But then when push comes to shove, we never know. We never know. People can be surprised not only by the good they do, but people can be surprised by the evil that they do, even with the determination not to do it. So we have to be careful. It's good to be idealistic, but we can't judge others when they're in the midst of that situation. You know, the pressures can be extreme, right? But whether or not, we're talking idealistic level or not, there's a huge difference between doing an action in which you're really motivated by hatred to do it, or whether you're motivated by the fear that someone else is going to attack you if you don't do it. You know, the presence of the delusion on the mind is quite obviously different. One, you're burning with a hatred, you know, cruelty. And the other one, it's like you feel you have no choice. Yeah. In fact, I remember reading an account of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who was talking to, as he often does, to refugees who escape from Tibet. And among them there are those who were forced by their oppressors to really do some very, very evil things, you know, to, you know, as part of the demoralization of the Tibetan population. Villagers, for example, were forced to denounce lamas, kill monks and nuns. I don't want to give the list because it becomes horrific, you know. And of course, the oppressors have very ingenious and very, very cruel ways of forcing them in that situation. It was much more demoralizing for them to have the Tibetans carry out the atrocities rather than they themselves doing it, right? It was very demoralizing. And so the Dalai Lama knew that there was a lot of people who came to him with this weight, this guilt on their mind of having engaged in actions which they didn't want to do, but the circumstances were such. And the Dalai Lama really tried to calm their minds by saying, you did it because you were forced to do it. So the strength of that action is not nearly the same as it would be if you actually had the motive of wanting to do it, of wanting to harm someone else. So that way he was able to kind of relieve some of the conscience of the people who were in that situation. And of course you would hope that you'd be strong enough to resist. But I wouldn't want to adopt the superior attitude that they're not going to make me do that. They might make someone else do it, but they're never going to make me do that. That, you know, one would hope, but you can't be sure that's going to happen. Can't be sure. You wanted to add something?
Yeah. So, in what you're saying, I'm just being very open and very, you know, what I'm feeling. And also, if you say that, how can I put the word? I don't think the consequences, but you know, when you're saying like you have certain people that are so atrociously malignant, and if these people, the Tibetan peoples, to protect their own people instead of killing their own, I mean, they're organized to actually just remove that negativity of these other beings.
Of the oppressors?
Yeah, like instead of killing their own people, there are people that are innocent, maybe doing the same thing, but you know, to the negative people, they're coming there to hurt, like to protect. So I see that a difference in that reaction. It's the same ending, the same killing and atrocity, but the intention too is very different. So I'm just talking of what you're saying and thinking. So it's all bad, but is that the same like you were talking about the intention? So it's like a little complicated.
Well, it is. Karma is a bit complicated in that respect. It's not so cut and dry.
But
That's why you try to engage in the action with the best possible motivation. Okay. So the third one is the force of the action itself. Right? So let's say if you're someone who lives in an area where the only thing that you can eat to survive is an animal. There's no vegetables around, right? Well, then you may be forced in a situation to kill that animal. And yet you may feel that there's something really negative about doing that. Well, there are different ways of killing. Killing relatively quickly and painlessly is better than a long, slow, prolonged death that causes a lot of anguish to the victim. Right? They're both killing. They're both taking the life. So the action is the same. But here, but the specific nature of the action is the same. But the action, the way it's carried out is different. One is relatively quick and painless, and the other is relatively more drawn out and more painful. So clearly the karmic consequences of one is less than the karmic consequences of the other. Okay. Then the fourth one, the D, is the action in relationship to the object. So killing a mosquito is killing. Killing one's spiritual guru is killing, right? But the object is quite different. You know, one's teacher, one's parents, a highly evolved being. If one of those is the object of the killing, the consequences are much heavier than killing a mosquito. So the strength of the object, the quality of the object, also can determine a difference in the weight of the karmic action. Okay? The next one, E, the frequency of the commitment, we'll see that this also has a very specific relationship to the opponent powers that we're going to talk about in a minute. So, for example, in our lifetime, there may be something that we did that we regret, but we only did it once. And then our regret was strong enough that we really made every attempt not to do it again. Or maybe it was an action that we engaged in 2 or 3 times, but the feeling grew up within us, no, this is incorrect, and we make a resolution not to do it again. That's quite different from someone who engages in negative, harmful action again and again and again and again and again. So the frequency of committing it makes a very significant difference. And this we can, this is not so difficult to understand, because if we take karma as an expression of the fact that we live in what's fundamentally a mentally conditioned universe, right? Then doing something repeatedly is conditioning our mind much more than if we just do it occasionally. It's like making an imprint. If you pound on something many, many times, the imprint you make is deeper, stronger. Right? If you just pound on something once or twice, you might make a little dent, but not much of an impression. So the deeper the impression on the mind, the stronger the consequence of the action, both for good and for evil. Right? This is the same analysis is for doing a virtuous action. There's some people who most of their life they're stingy, but on 1 or 2 occasions they act generously. Right? Well, that's good. That makes an impression. But compare that to someone whose main approach to life is to be generous and open-handed. And every situation that arises that's possible, this man or this woman acts in this charitable, open-handed, benevolent manner. Quite clearly, the impression on that person's mind of the virtue is much stronger than the person who just does it once or twice, almost as an aberration. So it's true for negative actions and for positive actions that the frequency of the commitment also, did I say commit? Yeah, of committing the action. The frequency of committing the action was also one of the determining factors for how strong the consequence is. Okay? And then the final one is the presence or absence of opponent forces. And this, even by the title, you can tell that this is going to have a very strong connection with the 4 so-called opponent powers. But just to give, before we get into more detail, just to give a kind of a preview of what this means is For this one, there's an example from a movie that was very famous quite a number of years ago, but I don't know how many people saw it. It was the movie Gandhi, the life of Mohandas Gandhi. How many people saw that movie? Many people here, okay? So there was one scene in that movie that for me, it was actually the strongest scene in the whole movie, even though the movie was filled with very powerful images, right? Just to set the scene, a riot or violent, what they called communal violence, at this point in the story had broken out between the Muslims and the Hindus in Calcutta. And so this was, of course, totally opposed to everything that Gandhi and his movement stood for. So Gandhi took personal responsibility for this, and he went to Calcutta. And the means that he had for overcoming that communal violence was to fast. Right? He was of such a character that the possibility that he might fast himself to death was very frightening to the people of India, Hindus and Muslims alike. He was regarded in his lifetime, as he was, a saint, right? So he basically announced that he was going to fast, even if it meant killing himself, until the violence between these communities stopped. And if you remember that scene, it took place on the roof of a building somewhere in Calcutta, and there was crowds around, and Gandhi was sitting on one of these rope beds that Indian people often use, and he was surrounded by some of his closest followers, including Nehru, right? And he was very, 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 very weak, on the verge of dying. Right? And suddenly, out of the crowd came one man. I remember his face because it was marked with smallpox. And you see that a lot in India. People had smallpox when they're younger, and then they get these pox on their face. And this man looked like that. And he was holding a chapati, a tortilla. Right? Do you remember that? He came, and he went right up to Gandhi, and he threw this chapati onto Gandhi, and he says, "Eat this. I'm not going to have your death on my consciousness also." Right? And so Gandhi asked him, "What did you do, my son?" And he said, "In the communal violence, I killed a young Muslim boy. He himself was Hindu. I killed a Muslim boy. So I know I'm going to hell to that, but I refuse to go to hell for being the reason that you die." Right? It was bad enough I had to kill this boy, but I want you to eat and live because I couldn't bear to have it on my consciousness that I could have been partly responsible for you dying. He didn't say all those words, but that's what he meant. Okay? And then Gandhi answers, "I know a way out of hell." And of course the man didn't expect that. And Gandhi explained, he said, in this war, this communal violence is taking place in Calcutta, many children have been orphaned. Right? I want you to go into the community and find a young boy who has been orphaned in this violence and raise him as your son. But raise him as a Muslim. And the man is quite stunned by this advice. But that's exactly what it's talking about in letter F. That if one has created a negative action, one can apply various opponent forces to it, which can help neutralize or modify or severely weaken the strength of that negative action. So Gandhi's advice was, the negative action was killing a young Muslim boy. A positive action which is strong enough to counterbalance it would be to raise a Muslim orphan as your own son and make sure he gets a good Muslim education, like that. I mean, difficult advice, but in a way, when you think about it, absolutely brilliant. You know, if killing the boy is the cause for a hellish type of rebirth, however we envision what hell might mean, just means an experience of extreme suffering, then to counterbalance it with an act of incredible loving kindness and protection would be one very powerful way of helping neutralize that action. And that's just one example, but I use it because that scene affected me so strongly. I mean, I saw it, must have been close to 30 years ago now, and I can remember that scene so vividly. So, keeping this list of factors in the back of our mind, then we can look more closely at a way of applying the 4 opponent powers. Okay?